My friend and fellow author Blair Lynn remembers the moment the floor dropped out beneath her. What followed were panic attacks, ER visits, and waves of anxiety so intense they left her trembling, breathless, and afraid she might die. As a Christian, she knew she should cast her cares on God, but she didn't know how. In the depths of fear and discouragement, simple answers and spiritual cliches fell flat. There was no quick fix, no bypassing the valley. In Made to Tremble, Blair shares how she learned to walk with God through her anxiety, not around it. With scripture, story, and raw honesty, she shows what it means to embrace our weakness, not as failure, but as the place where God meets us most tenderly. This is a book for anyone who feels overwhelmed, afraid, or unsure if faith can hold in the storm. Through Blair's story, discover the peace of God and a deeper awe of the God of peace. Get your copy at madetotremble.com. What do you do when it feels like your spiritual life is crumbling? When trusted leaders fail, doubts rise, grief hits, and you don't know what to believe in anymore? In her new book, Someone to Believe In, Embracing the Saviour Who Stays the Same When Everything Else Changes, author and Bible teacher Courtney Reisig helps us to see Jesus' unshakable character. If you're not sure whether you believe in Jesus yet, or if your faith feels unsteady in the face of grieving, burnout, or disillusionment, this book invites you to encounter Jesus as the one who is the same yesterday, today, and forever. Get your copy of Someone to Believe In today at someonetobelievein.com. You're listening to Confronting Christianity, a podcast of Training the Church.
Why can't he actually cleanse the temple 3 or 4 times, of which we've only got 2 recorded? If Jesus is upset by what's going on in the temple, I don't see why he can't protest it every time he goes as an adult. I'm really glad that in Matthew and Mark, you have the feeding of the 4,000 and the feeding of the 5,000. You've got both. It's the fact that it happens twice in one gospel that forces you to say, they seem to be telling us this happened more than once. I think the question of how it happens can't necessarily be definitively answered, but the question of that it happened, that can be shown.
I'm talking today with my friend, Dr. Peter J. Williams, otherwise known as Pete. Pete holds an MA, MPhil and PhD in the study of ancient languages related to the Bible from Cambridge University. He's taught at Cambridge and University of Aberdeen in Scotland, and he currently serves as principal of Tyndale House, which is a Cambridge-based research institute housing one of the world's most advanced libraries for biblical scholarship. Pete is the author of a number of excellent books, including Can We Trust the Gospels?, which I actually currently have on loan to a non-Christian friend of mine, and most recently, The Surprising Genius of Jesus, which I currently have on loan to my daughter. So all of your books are sort of flying around the place from my house, Pete. When I say all of your books, at least 2 of your recent and extremely helpful books.
Yeah.
You were just telling me a minute ago that you had a publication in the last year that you were especially surprised by because it was in the scientific journal Nature. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, well, Rebecca, it's great to be with you and glad the books are being put to good use. Yes, I actually had my research featured in an article in Nature and by Joe Marchant, which is basically building off a discovery I made in a text of a manuscript, which was the first known map of the night sky. So if you just Google first known map of the night sky and my name, you should get through to that and some news it got into, I don't know, many different languages, 20 plus news cycles. I even got in Vice magazine, which is really quite funny, but National Geographic and the rest of those guys. So it's all quite funny.
Extraordinary. Did you just come across this by accident, as it were?
Well, nothing's by accident, but it was during lockdown and I was staring at the screen of a manuscript. And back in the older days, people used to recycle a lot, but we didn't really come up with that. And particularly in the medieval stage, with a manuscript, if it's made of leather, do you really want to have to kill a whole load more animals just to write a few more pages? Well, why not rub out some text from someone in the past that you didn't really care about and then write some stuff up on top? And that's what people do. But now we've got the tech with multispectral imaging and so on to actually bring the text that's rubbed out back. And so with the help of some very fancy images and some clever programmers, and then about 2 weeks of hard slogging per page staring at a screen, we managed to read stuff that hadn't been read before. And I happened to spot the first known star coordinates, the lot of the greatest Greek astronomer Hipparchus that had been thought to be lost for a long time. And no, they were actually on my screen.
Amazing. I was just telling you before we chatted that I didn't want you to use any fancy technical terms, but I actually especially like the fancy technical word for a text that's sort of hidden under another text like that. So can you tell us what it is?
Yes, the word palimpsest, where one thing's written on top of another. And just, it's worth remembering there's lots of recycling going on if you're having to write on leather. So it goes on for 400 or 500 years, from about 700 through to 1100 is the peak season for doing that, although it can happen at any time.
So I hadn't actually intended for this to be any kind of decent bridge into our main conversation today, but it kind of is actually, because the two books that I want to talk with you about are both your most recent book, The Surprising Genius of Jesus, What the Gospels Reveal About the Greatest Teacher, and also your previous book, Can We Trust the Gospels? And I think one of the big questions that people legitimately have when it comes to what the four Gospels in our Bibles, the so-called Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, what they are, and whether we can see them as giving us any real access to this first century Jewish rabbi, Jesus of Nazareth, it is the thought that they're written actually a long time after Jesus's death and after the things that they record about him. So can you help us understand, like, how far after Jesus's life, death, and resurrection were the four Gospels in our Bibles written, and what does that mean about how seriously we can take them as a historical documents?
Yes. So I'd say that they're written in one generation. So I'm not talking about in terms of numbers of years. My granny is actually 103. Had photos of her seeing my brother today. And, she can tell us about what happened 70 or 80 years ago.
Gosh.
But the key thing is with the Gospels is you can actually tell from the type of way that they're reporting that they cannot have been through many, many cycles of retelling. Otherwise, they wouldn't be able to have accurate records of all the sorts of details they do about names of places and people and customs and so on. So I like to think of them as, in terms of the generation, their first generation documents. Of course, they may only be a few decades afterwards. And the key thing about that is it's long enough for things to be wrong and short enough for them to be right. So I think that sometimes people feel that, like, you can win the question of whether they're reliable based simply on the age. And you can't, because someone could lie about what happened yesterday or tell the truth about what happened 80 years ago. So that's where I would say the very nature of the Gospels drives us to look into them, to look for signs of whether they're reliable or not. Because there weren't lots of cameramen going around the Sea of Galilee when Jesus was going around there. In fact, there's just about nothing written by anyone about what happens around the Sea of Galilee around the time of Jesus, other than in the Gospels.
Oh, wow.
So that means that you are driven to the stories themselves. But that doesn't mean you can't have signs of reliability, because I would say if you get the same traits of speech, hallmarks of someone's personality showing up in one narrative and then in a separate narrative written by a different author, that gives you pretty good reason to think they go back to one person. And I think we can do that again and again with the Gospels.
So let's unpack that a little bit. I think some people say, listen, I can't remember what I had for breakfast last Tuesday, or the conversation, the last conversation you and I had, which was a few years ago.
Sure.
So how could people remember, like, let's say it is decades after Jesus's teaching, death, supposed resurrection. How could people remember with so much detail, such kind of long speeches that Jesus made and precise details of the things that he said? Doesn't that seem a little far-fetched?
Yeah, I mean, I learned a few poems when I was 16 and doing my English literature, which I never enjoyed. But I think they're still there if I decide to access them. And that's something I didn't particularly enjoy. But I think if Jesus tells a story and it's a gripping story, and then he tells it multiple times, and his disciples actually have as a job that they are to learn what he says. I mean, what else does a disciple mean? It means a student. So Jesus has these 12 students going around with him, learning what he says. And I think, therefore, there's every reason to think that what he says can be captured. Of course, the Gospels are about 9 hours long. So we're talking about between 4 and 5 hours of Jesus's text, which is actually in the Gospels. There's some overlap there, and Jesus repeats himself. So all 4 Gospels present Jesus within that Gospel itself as repeating himself. So that's another element to it. Some of the sayings are extremely memorable. So it's not a question of just having to sit down and memorize someone as they're speaking. I don't think the Gospels report that happening. Something like called the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5 through to 7. It's 12 minutes long or so. People say, well, that's a speech. How could someone just memorize it on the spot? Well, firstly, it's probably Jesus's sort of main curriculum, which he repeats again and again. And it's not portrayed as a speech. It's portrayed as a lesson. He goes up on the mountain and he teaches them. So with something like the Beatitudes, which are where he says, blessed are such and such, he could be saying that, repeat after me, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And people repeat it back, and then he teaches the next one. So there can be all sorts of ways in which that material can get transmitted. I think the question of how it happens can't necessarily be definitively answered, but the question of that it happened, that can be shown. So you can show that we've got a whole lot of very clever stuff, which seems to come from a single mind, which isn't the same as the mind who wrote the 4 Gospels.
So that point about Jesus repeating himself, presumably, I mean, as he traveled around to different villages and towns and was teaching in different places, unlike today, he didn't have the benefit or otherwise of a podcast that could be distributed in different places. So if I understand you correctly, Pete, you're saying, as Jesus sort of traveled around, he would have said the same or very similar things in different places. Does that help us to understand some of the differences between the Gospels? So you picked on the Beatitudes, one of the famous sections of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount in Matthew's Gospel, which also comes up in Luke's Gospel, but with some different words.
Yeah, sure.
Help us just understand that.
Well, I mean, I sort of want to know, what's the most number of times you've ever given a single talk?
Oh, gosh, yeah. We're
talking in dozens, yeah?
Yeah.
Maybe not that much. Maybe
not
I'm
quite,
more
but like probably up to, at least 15.
Okay, so 15. And then you'd have variations in wording between those different ones, because it's never the same talk.
Yeah.
But you might use some of the same lines and so on. So I think it's interesting that in Matthew's Gospel, you got blessed are the poor in spirit. And in Luke, you got blessed are the poor. And people say, well, which did he say? Is it one or the other? And yet, if you go over to John's Gospel, you can have Jesus in John chapter 10 telling you, I am the door of the sheep. And he can also tell you, I am the good shepherd, and I am the good shepherd laid down his life for his sheep. And he just says, I am the door. So I am the door of the sheep, or I am the door. Which of those two does he say? Well, in John's Gospel, he says both. So you can imagine a longer lesson in which he says, blessed are the poor in spirit and blessed are the poor. There's no problem with that. As you know, in the Gospels, we've got this account of the feeding of 5,000 people, where Jesus is said to feed 5,000 men plus women and children with, very little stuff. But you also have the feeding of the 4,000 in 2 of the Gospels, Matthew and Mark. Now, I'm really glad that in Matthew and Mark, you have the feeding of the 4,000 and the feeding of the 5,000. You've got both. Because I think if you just had the feeding of the 4,000 in one Gospel and the feeding of the 5,000 in another, you'd say, well, it was probably 4.5 and it only happened one time. It's the fact that it happens twice in one Gospel that forces you to say, they seem to be telling us this happened more than once. As with Greta Thunberg's protests that may look very similar, she does the same thing again and again, or, Jordan Peterson talks, or whatever it is. I mean, there are all sorts of different things where public figures repeat themselves and repeat particular actions as well as words. So I think that's part of the answer. I don't think that's the only thing, but sometimes what happens is we align a saying in one Gospel horizontally with the one in another Gospel, and it might just be missing the mark by a couple of minutes. Like you might be aligning it with the thing that was said 2 minutes earlier or 2 minutes later, for all we know. So once you allow Jesus to be repeating himself and doing variations on a theme, then you get back to reading the Gospels singly, as well as comparing them, but you don't just equate one phrase in one Gospel with the same in another.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. What do you think we should make of what appears to be different ordering sometimes of events in the Gospels? So, for example, when Jesus famously goes into the temple and sort of cleanses the temple, chucks out some of the people who are trading in there, overturns the tables. And in John's Gospel, that happens very early in Jesus' ministry, whereas other Gospels seem to put it much later. Help us understand what might be going on there.
So, I mean, I think you've got more than one way of doing this. I mean, some people would say there's been thematic arrangement on behalf of the gospel writers, and that's what's going on. I would tend to actually say, well, why can't he actually cleanse the temple 3 or 4 times, of which we've only got 2 recorded? That is, how many times, if you're a protester, and Jesus is being a protester, how many times do you protest the thing you don't like? So people could be on an environment protest, whatever it is, climate protest, and they do similar things multiple times. Why not? If Jesus is upset by what's going on in the temple, I don't see why he can't protest it every time he goes as an adult. And the argument that then, well, he'd never be let back in. Do you know how huge the temple is and how there is no face recognition back then because there's no photos, no one knows what anyone looks like. So, of course, you can get back and protest again. There's no way you can show a photo to all the guards and say, don't let this dude back in. So there's no reason why that shouldn't happen. So, yeah, I think sometimes what happens is people sort of begrudgingly say, oh, well, it might be possibly in a sort of extreme way that he could do the same thing more than once. Well, in Matthew's gospel, it's got him healing blind people who say, Son of David, have mercy on me, on 2 different occasions, 2 blind people both times. And you say, well, surely that can't happen twice. But of course it can. If the last lot were successful calling out, Son of David, have mercy on me, that's exactly the line I'm going to use.
Right.
So there can even be some sort of causal connection. So I think that, the Gospels present certain things as happening more than once. As I can say, I've sat down in more than one airport and played the piano. It's just things that I've done more than once. It's just,
That's again a lovely bridge to something else I was wanting to ask you about. So one of my favorite differences between the Gospels is when we see in Mark's Gospel, Mark giving us the name of one blind man who had called out to Jesus, Bartimaeus. And the blind men being anonymous in another account. So help us to understand how the Gospel authors seem to be using names. Why would we hear about Bartimaeus at that point rather than just another anonymous blind man?
Yeah, so I think obviously when you get a name, you can get more connection with a person. I love the name Bartimaeus, B-A-R, is Aramaic for son. That's a sort of local language around the time of Jesus. And Timaeus is a Greek name, and it's actually a dialogue by the philosopher Plato. So I wonder if maybe Grandpa, who called his son Timaeus, actually liked Plato. So it shows you some of the cultural mix of Aramaic and Greek going on there. And Mark has decided to focus in on this person more than happens in Matthew's gospel, where there are 2 blind men, where I think the focus is a little bit more on perhaps the act and on Jesus. You don't get the sort of focus on one individual, but I think that can be part of it. It could be Mark's writing for an audience who actually knew of Bartimaeus. I don't know that. There can be various possibilities.
What do you think of Richard Baucham's argument? I don't know that this is specific to Bartimaeus, but that often the Gospels are giving us names because they're citing their sources, as it were, giving us eyewitnesses who are particular sources for the things that they're saying. Yeah,
so I think his argument is definitely worthy of attention, and that's part of it. He claims that the mention of Peter, for instance, at the end or in Mark chapter 16, is part of the evidence that Peter's actually behind the account there. That may be the case. I've not chosen to repeat his arguments, so I'm happy for people to go to his books and read them there.
Oh, well, good. I choose to repeat them all the time because I find them fascinating. But I was curious for your thoughts. My son is named Luke because depending on the day, I either love John's Gospel or Luke's Gospel the most. It's sort of, Mondays and Wednesdays it's John, and Thursdays, Tuesdays and Fridays it's Luke. And your most recent book, The Surprising Genius of Jesus, is dialed in mostly on one particular story from Luke's Gospel. So I'd love for you to tell us a bit more about that and why you chose to focus in on that story.
Yeah, so I think Jesus' probably two most popular parables would be either the parable of the Good Samaritan or the parable of the prodigal son, or of the two sons. And of those two, that one's slightly longer, about 3 minutes long when you read it out loud. And it's a very powerful story that inspires lots of fiction and so on. And it goes to the root of a lot of our experience. Just about every adult growing up has experienced tussles of authority with their own parents. So there's that. We've also often experienced a sense of the older brother of keeping the rules and being a bit indignant about other people who don't. And so I think it taps in at a psychological level to our experience. But my argument in the book was there's a level of genius, not only because it's such a simple and powerful story, but also because it's a multi-level story. So
sorry, Pete, for those who are not familiar with the parable of the prodigal son, can you give us just the 1 minute version of it?
So the really brief thing is a man has two sons. The younger son comes to him and says, give me my share of the inheritance. He gives the inheritance to both of them. Younger son goes off to a far country, wastes it all, is brought very low, ends up feeding pigs and realizing this isn't very good and it's far better off with dad, comes back. Dad runs towards him, sees him in the distance, runs towards him, embraces him, kisses him, and throws a party. Older brother, who seems to have been working hard in the field, comes back and sees this party going on and is very, very resentful. Dad comes out to talk to him, and then the story ends without you knowing whether the older brother is really going to come in and celebrate or not. And so it's a very powerful story because you've got this wastrel or prodigal son who seems to not do the right thing, but actually gets reconciled to his father, and this hardworking but resentful older brother who may not be reconciled to his father. So I think it invites people who have, let's say, if you think of the father as a figure like God, it invites people who've been wandering away, running away from rules, running away from their parents, running away from God in their life to turn and come back and realize what a great welcome they would get from God. And also those who are sort of full of self-righteousness because they've always been keeping the rules and working hard, and they've never gone away a long way, that they can realize that they could be harboring a lot of resentment in their heart and not at all being close to their father or God. So that's why I think the story works at an emotional level, but it also seems to echo, I would say, all of the top stories in the first book of the Bible, Genesis, which is a book about 3-4 hours long, and it seems to hit on the entire cycle.
So unpack that just one step more for us. I have a Jewish background friend who's actually, one of her questions is that Jesus doesn't seem to be very convincingly Jewish to her, funnily enough, which I would have thought that the opposite would be the case. But give us a quick taster of that.
Well, one of them is the dramatic high point of the story is when the son decides he's going to return, and it says his father saw him afar off, and then it says really he's filled with compassion, and it says three things: he ran, embraced, and kissed him. Now, Luke says this story is being told by Jesus to people who are public sort of sinners known for their bad activities, as well as to scribes who copy out the scriptures, as well as some others. And if you know the scriptures like a scribe would have to, an actual Bible copyist, there's only one place in the Bible you get run, embrace, kiss. And that is Genesis 33, verse 4, where Esau, the older brother of Jacob, who has been cheated out of his entire inheritance, forgives him, runs, embraces, and kisses him. And so Jesus uses that as the high point of his story, is a reference to the Old Testament. And I think I can also show that verse was a particular part of the scribal curriculum at the time of Jesus. So that story, that point takes a bit more making, but that will be one of those links, and there are other ones.
Fascinating. Help us think more about the context clues, the sort of historical context clues that I know you were very helpfully identified in Can We Trust the Gospels, that would lead us to think that the Gospels were written actually in the place where they claim to have been written, and sort of by people who really knew their stuff in terms of what was going on at that time. Because you mentioned earlier that there are no other accounts of what was happening in the precise time and place that most of the Gospels are written. So help us understand that.
Yeah, so you can fairly easily check out, one of the easiest things to check out is whether they know the geography of the place they're writing about. So they portray Jesus as going around the Sea of Galilee, popping down to Jerusalem, going around various towns and this sort of thing. And you just check that out. And do they know whether land goes up and down, whether they use the verbs to go up and go down in the right place? And yes, they do. Do they know the names of villages? Yes, they do. So they at least have to come from the land. But of course, the land has a big change after the year 70 when the Romans come in. Yes, the hills don't move, but the who lives where changes an awful lot because the Romans wiped out a lot. So most Jews get removed from the land if they don't get killed. And so actually to have people who know that stuff in itself is not trivial. Then they also know about the coinage, the customs. They get the right proportions of people in different jobs that you would expect. They know about the fishing industry. They know where the tax collectors are supposed to be in that land. All those sorts of things they're getting right. And then you add to that you have these patterns of speech where amongst Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, Matthew, Mark and Luke are the most similar. And Matthew and Luke sometimes overlap in ways, but not in Mark. Then there are things that are only in Matthew, things that are only in Luke, things where all three Gospels overlap, or Matthew, Mark, Luke. Sometimes Matthew and Mark go together, sometimes Mark and Luke go together. All these different types of material. And you can test them and you can start looking at the patterns. And, people nowadays probably got a few more variations than they used to about what order they thought the Gospels were written in and which one might use which. But it doesn't matter which way you run it. You've got lots of different sorts of material and they're all showing with the same sort of knowledge of the area, and they're showing the same sort of patterns in Jesus' speech. So Matthew's Gospel will have Jesus telling a whole load of parables in a row, and Luke will have Jesus telling a whole load of parables, but different parables in a row. But the common pattern is they both have a storyteller who tells parables back to back, which no one else seems to do. So that seems to be a hallmark of a particular person. And rather than saying one writer looked at another writer and said, oh, he's got parables back to back, why don't I put parables back to back? An easier thing is to say there is a storyteller, Jesus, let's just call him J, who comes up with stories back to back. And then they have hallmarks of knowledge of rabbinic traditions. So lots of rabbinic stories about 99 and 1. Jesus has that in his story of the lost sheep. There's a rabbinic story about a lost coin. Jesus has that. So there are lots of things that really look very Jewish in the stories that Jesus tells as well.
Fascinating. I'm going to throw one more question at you, which is one I was recently asked myself, and I thought, I don't actually know. So when we are told in the Gospels that as Jesus died on the cross, the curtain in the temple that divided the sort of holiest place from the rest of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. A friend asked me, is there any evidence outside the Gospels that this happened? Is there any kind of Jewish record of something strange going on, or what do we make of that?
Yeah, so there's I suppose a couple of things in relation to that. One is there is a much later Jewish record in the Talmud about, it's a bit strange, it's talking about for the last 40 years of the temple, its doors opened of their own accord. So yes, which could be a garbled version of this, because if this happens around the year 30, that would also fit. And in Matthew's version, of course, there is an earthquake at this time. And according to the website deadseaquake.info, then you can look at the varves or the sediment layers in the Dead Sea, and you can see at least around this sort of time an earthquake with no earthquake for 3 decades or so before. So those could be a couple of angles on that for external support.
Fascinating. Well, thank you so much, Pete, for sharing a tiny sliver of your knowledge and understanding of these things with us. It's been a pleasure to chat with you.
And with you.
If you have enjoyed hearing our conversation, then we'd love for you to follow Confronting Christianity Podcast on Twitter or Instagram, or leave a review on iTunes. You can also include a question there that you'd like to see explored in a future episode. We'll take that into consideration. And please join me next week when I'll be interviewing another friend who wrote a book on the 10 Commandments. Until then.